The rights and responsibilities of the African American community has been prevalent throughout the history of the United States. Beginning in the year 1619, an English ship known as the White Lion brought the first enslaved Africans to America. This event is what began the African American community's fight for freedom in the United States. While it took over a century to improve their rights, they kept fighting for their freedom and liberty from slavery. Meanwhile, throughout the duration of their fight for freedom, one central idea had always been in mind: fighting for the equality that the African American community rightfully deserved. This topic alone was enough to divide the thriving nation and bring it to war against itself. This conflict shed so much blood on American soil, but it also paved the way for the improvement of African American rights for the first time in American history. While the African American community's fight for freedom was not an easy one, an event would soon take place that would change the trajectory of their fight for equal rights, and was a major stepping stone for the African American community. This is the Emancipation Proclamation, and the rights and responsibilities that it brought to the African American community.
The 1800s, a time of prosperity for the United States, who thought they had everything in order. However, there was only one issue that they could not agree upon: the topic of slavery. Before the 19th century, slavery was common across the United States and much more common in the South than the North. This opposition made a lot of sense since the South was home to most of the labor work, like the farms at the time, whereas the North was more focused on manufacturing and business. This meant there was more demand for labor in the South, and thus higher benefit for slavery.
During this time, African Americans weren't even considered people, meaning the South had a lower population than the northern states. This population gap was important since when determining a state's total population for legislative representation and taxation, population was a huge factor in doing so. Because of that, the South ended up having less legislative representation. Also, the South wanted African Americans to be considered people, but they still didn't want them to vote. This controversy led to a large debate between the North and the South, which then officially resulted in what is known as a 3/5 compromise. This compromise, officially started in the 1787 Constitutional Convention, declared that every African American was worth 3/5 of a person.
Opposition of slavery, as well as the idea of abolishing it in the United States, first began in the northern states. Among the earliest voices opposing slavery were the Quakers, a religious group which originated in Europe. They were the first people in the US to condemn slavery as morally wrong and undemocratic. In contrast, however, the South didn't see any problem with slavery and heavily relied on it for their agricultural economy. This stark difference between the North and South led to conflicts that would eventually lead to the creation and signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. The events that led to the Emancipation Proclamation are a compelling story that highlights a transformative change in American history that has an impact till today.
Another very important topic during this time was the presidential election of 1860. This election was crucial in deciding the fate of the United States because of all the political tension rising. Abraham Lincoln was a Republican Party candidate, and John Breckinridge was a Democratic candidate. This election was important because the South was largely composed of Democrats. This ideology was important because of the Democratic view of slavery and how the South's economy relied on slaves. The South and North tension was building, so after Abraham Lincoln was elected president on November 6, 1860, the South finally had enough. This election was a deciding factor that tipped the unstable balance between the North and the South, ultimately resulting in the American Civil War between the Union, the North, and the Confederacy, the South. In January of 1861, the South began to secede from the United States and formed their own territory known as the Confederate States of America. The nation was now divided into two, the Union and the Confederacy, marking the beginning of the American Civil War.
As the Civil War continued on in the United States, progress was made to improve the treatment of the African American community. However, one of the most important decisions made during the Civil War was the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation was written by Abraham Lincoln, and he wrote it because he believed that slavery was wrong and he wanted to end slavery in the United States. The Emancipation Proclamation declared that all slaves in the South were considered free by the United States, and the Union would now allow African Americans to fight for the Union's army. This meant that all African Americans living in the United States, regardless of their location, were no longer considered slaves. This declaration gave African Americans rights for the first time in history by establishing the federal government recognized African Americans as free people. It also meant that there was now a way for the African American community to fight for their rights unlike before. The Emancipation Proclamation wasn't viewed the same all around the world, however. In London, the Morning Post newspaper believed that the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation was a terrible decision made by the United States, and it also stated that it would be the death of the country if the United States was able to enforce the act. Meanwhile, other newspapers such as the Daily News, the Star, and the Telegraph supported the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, believing that it would be the end to slavery in the U.S. Additionally, the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation gave the African American community the right and responsibility to fight for the Union.
This was because if the Confederacy states won the Civil War, the bloodshed would have been for nothing, and nothing would have changed for the African American community. Slavery would not have been abolished. This meant that fighting for the Union was important to them, so that they could prevent their rights from being taken away from them again. It was also evident that the Union needed as many soldiers as they could get, as the Union began calling the African American community to come fight in the war against the Confederacy. They justified these calls to war by explaining that the Confederacy was the cruel enemy that they were against, and their service in the war would create a path forward for them as well. As a result of this call to action, the Union also began forming mostly African American military units, such as the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, which helped the United States in the Battle of Fort Wagner. These African American units were impactful during the Civil War, and they had even a larger impact on the African community's rights many years later. This highlights some of the responsibilities the African American community had to embrace as part of their newfound freedom.
Due to the responsibility that the United States government had, they began to alter the Constitution in order to fit modern standards of the time, creating and ratifying the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. These amendments prevented further slavery in the United States, ensuring that all African Americans were citizens of the United States, and made it so that African Americans had the right to vote for the first time in history. While the United States had a long way to go until the African American community would be seen as equals, they had paved the way for the future of the African American community with the creation of the Emancipation Proclamation. After the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, African Americans had now been given the greater responsibilities to fight for their freedom, liberty, and had gained their freedom from slavery. They took this opportunity to begin to make their own lives, as newfound freedoms gave them much more opportunities than they had ever had when they were under slavery.
The Civil War was primarily fought over the issue of slavery. So, after 4 long years of bloodshed on American soil, the Confederate General Robert E. Lee finally surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. After this long and gruesome war, the United States finally entered what is now known as Reconstruction era. This era of recovering from the Civil War lasted from 1865 to 1877 and paved the way for the improved rights of African Americans in the United States. During this era, the United States struggled with the issue of determining the legal status of African Americans. Since the Civil War had recently ended, African Americans who were formerly slaves now relied on the government for a path forward. Therefore, the government of the United States was now responsible for making sure that the African American community would have their rights protected. In conclusion, the Emancipation Proclamation had a large and direct impact on the rights and responsibilities of the African American community. It gave the African American community the responsibility to fight alongside the Union for their rights, and gave them the opportunity to have their own lives and be free from slavery in the United States. It helped pave the way for the future of the rights and responsibilities of the African American community, such as how it led to the government having the responsibility to protect the African American community. This led to the creation of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the Constitution, which further increased the opportunities that African Americans had in the United States. Alongside these impacts, it allowed the fight for the improved equality and treatment of the African American community to continue, which resulted in movements such as the Civil Rights Movement of 1964, contributing to the rights and responsibilities of the African American community.